Before we begin, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because stories like this rarely get told honestly. For decades, Kelsey Grammer was viewed as one of television's most polished and composed figures. His voice carried authority, intelligence, and calm. Whether he was delivering a cutting joke or an emotional monologue, he always appeared unshakable. But that image was only the surface. Behind the elegance and sharp wit was a man shaped by trauma long before fame found him. Long before audiences laughed inside a Boston bar called Cheers, Kelsey Grammer had already learned how fragile life could be. His journey wasn't one of overnight success or effortless confidence. It was built on survival, emotional restraint, and wounds that never fully disappeared. And years after the cameras stopped rolling, he finally spoke openly about one working relationship that affected him more deeply than anyone expected, not because of hatred, but because of unresolved pressure, grief, and incompatible ways of creating. Kelsey Grammer's story doesn't begin on a soundstage. It begins with loss. Born on February 21 in St. Thomas in the U.S. Virgin Islands, he grew up in a family that valued creativity but was scarred by violence. As a teenager, his life was shattered when his father, Frank Grammer Jr., was murdered during a home invasion. That kind of trauma doesn't fade with time. It rewires how a person understands safety, trust, and control. And before he could even begin to process that pain, tragedy struck again. His younger sister, Karen, was brutally murdered in a crime that would haunt him for the rest of his life. These were not distant memories or abstract grief. They were defining moments that shaped how Grammer reacted to conflict, authority, and emotional instability. Acting became more than ambition. It became refuge, a place where structure could replace chaos and discipline could hold pain at bay. Driven by that need for structure, Grammer earned his place at Juilliard, one of the most demanding drama schools in the world. There, he learned that performance wasn't about emotional indulgence, it was about control. Precision mattered. Discipline mattered. He absorbed a belief that would stay with him forever. If something isn't on the page, it doesn't belong on the stage. That philosophy gave him stability, but it also created tension later in his career, especially in television, where speed and flexibility often matter more than perfection. By the time he entered professional acting, Grammer carried both intense technical training and unresolved emotional pain. When he landed on Cheers, he wasn't a carefree actor enjoying success. He was a man still learning how to exist under pressure without breaking, and Cheers was anything but a gentle environment. Cheers looked warm and effortless on screen, but behind the scenes it was a pressure cooker. Filmed in front of a live audience, the show depended on perfect timing, fast rehearsal schedules, and strong personalities. Grammer entered that world as an outsider. The core cast had already bonded, developing rhythms that extended beyond the scripts. Breaking into that dynamic required more than talent, it required emotional resilience. Audiences saw Frasier Crane as confident and articulate, but the man portraying him was still navigating grief, insecurity, and addiction. Every disagreement felt heavier. Every conflict echoed deeper. In hindsight, Cheers didn't just introduce Grammer to fame. It placed him in an environment that tested every unresolved wound he carried with him. What many fans don't realize is that Frasier Crane was never meant to stay. He was designed as a temporary character, a short-term intellectual rival to Sam Malone, and a brief romantic complication for Diane Chambers. Grammer was told to expect only a handful of episodes, but something unexpected happened. Audiences responded immediately. Frasier's arrogance, vulnerability, and emotional volatility struck a chord. Writers expanded his role. Producers noticed the chemistry. What began as a guest appearance slowly became permanent, and that shift changed the balance of the show in ways no one anticipated. Cheers had always revolved around Sam and Diane. Ted Danson and Shelley Long were the gravitational center, narratively and culturally. Their relationship powered the show. Frasier's growing presence disrupted that balance. Suddenly, Diane wasn't only defined by Sam. She had an intellectual equal, someone who matched her language, her intensity, and her emotional complexity. That change wasn't just creative, it was personal. Shelley Long was deeply invested in Diane Chambers. She analyzed scripts meticulously, challenged dialogue, and often pushed for rewrites. Her commitment was real, but it clashed with a production that thrived on speed and momentum. Grammer's approach was the opposite. He trusted the script. He trusted instinct. He believed comedy lived in rhythm, not endless revision. As Frasier gained importance, those differences became impossible to ignore. Scenes involving Diane and Frasier often took longer to rehearse. Disagreements over tone and wording became more frequent. What had once been a stable hierarchy felt uncertain. Grammer wasn't just supporting anymore, he was essential. For him, that rise was validating but emotionally overwhelming. For Long, it felt like the ground shifting beneath her. As the show's success grew, patience diminished. Schedules tightened. Expectations rose. Creative conflict became harder to contain. Long's perfectionism, once admired, began to frustrate cast and crew. She questioned dialogue during table reads and stopped rehearsals to debate motivation. Some saw professionalism. Others saw disruption. Grammer later admitted that working in that environment felt emotionally suffocating. He was already struggling internally, and the tension on set amplified everything he hadn't healed. Paragraph 9. Rumors eventually began to circulate that Frasier's continued presence was a deliberate move by producers to challenge Shelley Long. Grammer repeated this belief years later, describing his role as less a reward and more a weapon in an unspoken power struggle. Producers disputed that interpretation, but the damage was already done. The environment had become uncomfortable, heavy, and emotionally draining. Cheers was no longer just a job, it was Sir. When Shelley Long decided to leave Cheers, audiences were stunned. At the height of its popularity, she walked away. Behind the scenes, many understood why. Years of pressure, scrutiny, and creative stagnation had taken their toll. Long later admitted she felt trapped by Diane, a character that no longer allowed growth. For Grammer, her departure changed everything. Almost immediately, the atmosphere shifted. Rehearsals moved faster. Interactions felt lighter. The tension that once filled the room slowly lifted. The arrival of Kirstie Alley as Rebecca Howe marked a profound shift in the dynamic of Cheers. Unlike Diane Chambers, Rebecca was less analytical, less rigid, and brought an energy that was instinctive, playful, and emotionally grounded. Where Shelley Long had been deeply intellectual, often challenging dialogue and pushing for precision, Alley embraced spontaneity and responded naturally to her fellow actors. For Kelsey Grammer, this difference was transformative. The set suddenly felt lighter, more collaborative, and emotionally safer. It wasn't that his previous working relationship had been hostile. It had been intense, pressing, and exhausting in a very different way. But with Alley, there was space for dialogue, laughter, and connection. Grammer often spoke about her generosity and emotional presence, particularly in moments when he was struggling with personal demons. Her approach allowed him to perform with more freedom and fewer anxieties. The chemistry between actors is rarely visible to the audience, but it profoundly shapes the quality of performance. With Alley, the team adapted quickly. The show maintained its comedic brilliance, but the emotional tone behind the scenes shifted from strain to support, highlighting how critical interpersonal compatibility is, not just for success, but for the well-being of the performers. As Cheers drew to a close, Kelsey Grammer faced an unexpected turning point. Frasier Crane had evolved from a temporary character to a cultural icon, and the question of whether to continue the role beyond Boston became both a professional and deeply personal decision. Initially, Grammer was hesitant. He feared falling back into repetitive storylines, reopening past tensions, and confronting old emotional wounds that he had only just begun to manage. Yet, producers designed the spin-off carefully, mindful of his concerns, relocating Frasier to Seattle, far from the shadow of Cheers. This new setting wasn't just a backdrop. It represented a psychological and creative clean slate. For Grammer, the move allowed both the character and the actor to grow. Frasier could evolve without constant comparisons, while Grammer could continue his craft without the suffocating pressures that had once defined his life on set. In interviews, he reflected on how creating this separation between past and present allowed him to reclaim a sense of control and to approach performance with joy rather than survival instincts. The spin-off would eventually become a landmark success, but for Grammer, the emotional significance was as important as the critical acclaim. Distance and time softened the memories of conflict with Shelley Long. Grammer spoke about her in later years with nuance and reflection, emphasizing understanding over blame. He acknowledged the genuine care and dedication that Long brought to her craft, even if their approaches clashed dramatically on set. It wasn't hostility that defined their relationship, but two highly driven professionals reacting under extreme pressure without the emotional tools to bridge differences. Grammer also confronted his own role in the friction. Fame had amplified his insecurities and addictions. Personal struggles narrowed his patience and heightened sensitivity. What had once felt like antagonism, he began to see as a mirror of his own challenges, a reflection of the pressures and anxieties of sudden stardom. This realization allowed him to process those years with clarity, replacing resentment with understanding. He recognized that the tension on Cheers wasn't a personal vendetta, but the natural outcome of ambition, personality differences, and high-stakes television production. Media, however, distilled complex experiences into simple narratives. Headlines framed heroes and villains, distilled conflict into sound bites, and labeled Grammer and Long in ways that often distorted the truth. Most hated co-star became a catchy but misleading description that stuck in the public imagination. Grammer resisted that narrative, understanding that storytelling in the media often sacrifices nuance for drama. From his perspective, Cheers wasn't broken by hatred or rivalry. It was defined by extraordinary pressure, where differences in creative philosophy became magnified and amplified by the live audience, tight schedules, and high expectations. Two professionals, each deeply committed, collided because the environment demanded perfection at a pace that allowed no room for reconciliation or compromise. That tension, when interpreted by outside observers, became fodder for gossip rather than a study of human complexity under extreme conditions. It's important to recognize what each actor brought to Cheers. Shelley Long built the foundation. Her meticulous approach ensured quality, consistency, and precision. Grammer entered carrying personal trauma, struggles with addiction, and a deep need for emotional security. The collision of these factors created friction, but it also contributed to the show's energy and brilliance. The performances we saw on screen were, in part, shaped by the intensity behind the camera. Laughter, timing, and chemistry flourished alongside moments of tension, not in spite of them. Grammer's reflections highlight a rarely acknowledged truth, that sitcom production can coexist with quiet struggles, and that the personal costs of success are often invisible to audiences. Cheers' legacy isn't only about humor, it's about resilience, adaptation, and the emotional labor invested by its performers. Grammer has spoken openly about the ways that the pressures of Cheers intersected with his personal life, creating a perfect storm of stress, anxiety, and emotional strain. Recovery and emotional regulation became extraordinarily challenging during this period. Every day on set was a delicate balancing act, performing flawlessly in front of a live audience while managing inner turmoil. The work itself, demanding and precise, mirrored the structure and discipline he had learned at Juilliard, yet it lacked the emotional safety he craved. Grammer described the set as a mirror, reflecting unresolved trauma, fear, and insecurity. The laughter and applause might have seemed effortless, but behind the camera, the stakes were intensely personal. Success and personal struggle existed side by side, shaping him as both an actor and a human being. This duality underscores how entertainment often masks the private battles of its performers. Despite past tensions, reconciliation and understanding eventually emerged. Grammer expressed openness to reconnect with former castmates, including Shelley Long. Time, distance, and reflection softened bitterness. He recognized that both parties had acted under extraordinary pressures and that growth and healing were possible once the immediacy of production faded. While the media narrative emphasized conflict, the personal reality was more complex. Forgiveness, empathy, and perspective replaced lingering resentment. For Grammer, this evolution was not about absolving past difficulties, but about reclaiming peace and appreciating the artistry and effort behind every performance. He came to understand that both tension and collaboration had shaped Cheers into the cultural touchstone it became. This story illustrates a broader truth about creative work. Intensity and friction often coexist with brilliance. High-pressure environments can produce extraordinary art, but they can also leave emotional scars. Two talented individuals, working at peak performance under tight schedules, inevitably navigate moments of conflict. Grammer's reflections remind us that success is rarely linear and that the public often sees only the polished surface. The real story lies in the human experience behind the work, in vulnerability, endurance, and the gradual understanding of oneself and others. Cheers stands as an example of this duality, a show that achieved iconic status while quietly testing the emotional limits of those who brought it to life. Even decades later, the legacy of Cheers remains remarkable not only for its humor, but also for the emotional intensity behind it. The laughter that audiences enjoyed coexisted with challenges, anxieties, and personal growth that few outsiders could perceive. Grammer's journey illustrates how success can amplify both talent and personal struggle. The show's brilliance emerged not despite conflict, but through the tension and dedication of its performers. Understanding this context allows us to appreciate the courage it took to perform under such pressure, to navigate relationships, and to continue evolving as an artist while managing personal challenges. In many ways, the story behind the scenes is as compelling as what appeared on screen. So now we leave you with a question. Did the creative tension on Cheers ultimately make the show stronger, or did it leave emotional damage that never fully healed? Who was your favorite character, and what moments from the series resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective matters. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this deep dive into television history, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Stories like these remind us that the magic we see on screen is shaped not only by talent, but also by humanity, struggle, resilience, and the complex relationships that define life behind the camera.